So hello and welcome everybody to our panel on disappearances of migrants as a challenge for international human rights law and humanitarian action. My name is Barbara Lochbihler. I am a member of the Committee Against Enforced Disappearance within the United Nations since 2019. And within this committee and also outside with civil society, we discuss a lot about enforced disappearance in the context of migration, the situation for migrants and also for refugees. And this is by no means a problem only of a few states. Also, there is a particularly large number of migrants and refugees who have been forcibly disappeared in the context of Mexico and Central America. But there are also cases of suspected forcibly disappeared migrants, and they have been publicly reported from Greece, Croatia, Nigeria, Algeria, Thailand, China, Malaysia, the United States, Egypt, Sudan, Libya, the Gulf countries, and others. And also disappearances on various migration routes are widely reported. There is little discussion about the legal obligation of states. And let me stress, perhaps at the beginning of our debate, that migration as such has always happened and is a growing phenomenon as the gap between rich and poor is widening, as oppressive regimes are gaining ground in many regions of the world, as war and armed conflict is a terrible reality in several countries, and not least, as climate change is driving away thousands of people when making their home region as uninhabitable place. All this is known to political decision makers, in Europe for sure. And still, when presenting the current asylum and migration package, the European Union offers again no perspective for orderly migration to Europe and is not providing adequate access to the right for asylum to refugees. As a previous member of the European Parliament, I am appalled that the European Union is continuing to neglect the protection of basic human rights of migrants and refugees who need protection and help, and not being driven into illegality and life-threatening migration routes. The increasing dangerous journeys of migrants and refugees and the ever more rigid migration policies of states cause a particular risk for migrants to become victims of enforced disappearances. The UN Working Group on Enforced or Involuntary Disappearances, in a report from 2017, left no doubt that this complex phenomenon should urgently be given adequate consideration. I quote, "States and the international community as a whole do not seem to be given the necessary attention to this issue." So my committee, the UN Committee on Enforced Disappearances, flagged the increased risk for enforced disappearances as a result of migration in the guiding principles for the search for disappeared persons. These highlight the additional obstacles for the relatives of disappeared migrants and refugees related to possible undocumented status, language barriers, being in a country other than their own, in which the disappearance occurred, and state authorities evading their responsibilities. I'm glad that our committee has now appointed special rapporteurs on the issue of enforced disappearance and migration to go further and developing also kind of authoritative status on the obligations states have arising from the Convention on Enforced Disappearances. And there is the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly and Regular Migration, which also tackles the problem and calls coordinated international efforts on missing migrants in accordance with international law. The resolution of the UN General Assembly on the protection of migrants, adopted in December 2019, recalls the obligation of states to protect the human rights of migrants and international human rights law. Obviously, there is a sincere human rights problem, and just as obviously, it must be taken much more serious by states than at present. With regard to migrants and refugees, all states, and particularly those who, being a state party to the International Convention on Enforced Disappearance, bear responsibility and legal obligations for their protection and the prevention of their enforced disappearance. So I'm really thrilled that for this panel we have found two excellent researchers and experts to discuss the issue on enforced disappearances in the context of migration. So we have with us Ana Lorena Delgadillo Perez from Mexico. She is founder and director of the Fundación para la Justicia y el Estado Democrático de Derecho. She works since many years on access to justice, on human rights and on women's rights. In recent years, more and more, the rights of migrants became the focus of her work. Her foundation is very engaged in securing the right of relatives of disappeared persons. She has an enormous amount of experiences, not only in her own country, Mexico, but also in the region of the Americas, and is experienced, of course, on how the ICPPED, the convention, is implemented and where are the limits. Welcome, Ana Lorena. And then we have Dr. Grażyna Baranowska. She is an assistant professor at the Institute of Law Studies of the Polish Academy of Science. And starting September 2021, she will be based at the Hertie School in Berlin for her Marie Sklodowska-Curie Action Project on Missing Migrants. In her previous work as a researcher and policy advisor on enforced disappearances at the German Institute for Human Rights, she published a report on disappeared migrants and refugees. Her book, Rights of Families of Disappeared Persons and How International Bodies Address the Needs of Families of Disappeared Persons in Europe, is forthcoming with Intersentia, the Transnational Justice Series, in summer of 2021. So welcome, Grażyna. And now let us start with listening to the presentations and then entering the debate.
We have different problems that the families face in terms of the searching of the migrant, problems that are have more obstacles for the searching, because we know that the families are not in the country where the disappearance take place, or the families are not in the country where the bodies are, so they have problems to get close to the authority in charge of the investigation or in charge of the searching. We don't have also centralized information like data information of bodies that are unidentified, or information about people that is missing. The National Commission for Search is starting the work in this documentation, but is not complete yet. So I think the lack of information, of centralized information, is something that is giving us difficulty also to have an idea about the phenomenon of the disappearances in Mexico, and also about the phenomenon of the disappearance of migrants. So we have also, I think in some other panels, they are going to talk about this. We have a lot of problems with the coordination of the institution in Mexico in charge of the searching and in the investigation. You know that we have different institutions for the searching and different institutions for the investigation, and we have a lot of problems for the coordination. And but also we have problems with the coordination of the different countries, the countries where the families are, the countries where the bodies are, or the countries where the migrants have been disappeared. So some public policies have been pushed in these years. Some of these policies have been pushed for NGOs and committees of families of missing migrants, like the Forensic Commission that was created in 2013. This Forensic Commission is dedicated to identify bodies of 3 massacres that occurred in the north of Mexico in 2010, 2011, and 2012. And this is a good practice because it's a commission where you have the participation of forensic of a state, of the General Attorney Office, and independent forensics, the Argentina forensic team. And I think this good practice is gonna give us a lot of lessons to learn before all the challenges that we have to identify all of the remains that still are unidentified in the hands of the state. In this new effort that the Mexican state is doing to create this big mechanism for identification, the bodies of all the countries. And we have, but by the other hand, we have an external support mechanism for searching migrants. It's supposed to be the door of justice for the families that are in some other countries. They can go directly to the consulate or to the embassies of the Mexican state to put a report in a case that they have a migrant that have been missing or have been killed. The thing is that these offices are not working in a proper way. But now, for example, during the pandemic, we are using a lot the technology to get close the authorities and the families, like in Skype conversations or using some other ways to have communication. Okay, so I would like to have some reflections about what is happening in terms of the conceptualization of cases of enforced disappearances of migrants. Since 2009, we have a situation of disappearances of migrants that was outlined by the Mexican Human Rights Commission, the National Human Rights Commission, where they documented these 20,000 cases that I told you about. The thing is that they call these cases kidnapping. They didn't were aware of the context of the country, of the context of the violence. So, for example, you have cases where the migrants were taken off from buses by police officers, and then they were handled, these migrants, to the organized crime, and still they call these cases kidnapping. Or you have some cases, for example, where the migrants were kidnapped by organized crime groups, but then you have official of state authorities that are giving protection to these organized groups. They know where they have the migrants. They know that they are kidnapping the migrants. They get paid for this protection, or they ignore to start an investigation. And these cases are still considered as kidnapped, and the state ignores the participation of the states. And some other cases, for example, in the transit, we have seen cases where the state agencies are stopping migrants or have detentions of migrants, and they say to the migrants, okay, you are here in the country committing a crime because you are traveling without no documentation. they rob the migrants, they make extortions to the migrants, and they put them in places where they know that later on the organized crimes are going to come and are going to kidnap them or are going to disappear them. And these actions are not investigated by the state for disappearances. And in general, I think we need to make deeper reflections about how to use the context of where the disappearances occur in a country as Mexico, where we have more than 84,000 cases of disappearances, but also to think further if there is a specific time that you need to prove or that you need to have to prove that that is enforced disappearances. For example, if the police have the migrants 1 hour or 1 day and then they deliver the migrants to the organized crime, this period of time, do you have to consider that time like enforced disappearances? How do we value the time that the migrants are in the hands of the organized crime? And just to finish this first reflection, the problem about intersectionality. When we have a case of enforced disappearances, the problem that we have is that we don't have the investigation of all the other violations of crimes that occur around the disappearances. For example, if you have torture, the torture is not investigated. If you have a mass grave where you find bodies and you have testimonies that these migrants have been first detained by police officers and then deliver these migrants to the organized crime, the state only investigate the homicide, but the state doesn't investigate the possible torture, the disappearances, or any other conduct that occurred before the killing of the migrants. So I think there is a problem that is happening in terms of the investigation. This is happening also for the National Human Rights Commission, the National Human Rights Commission, in the report that they made about the massacre of the migrants, they ignore the conducts that occur before the killing of the migrants. So this is a problem that we're still having in terms of the intersectionality of the different conducts that occur. And also, to end this first participation, I think we don't have like a correct approach to the migrants' victims based on their own social vulnerability profile. For example, we have migrants that have been disappeared that come from indigenous communities. We don't see that special vulnerability. We have migrants that do not speak the language of the country where they have been disappeared. We don't see that. We don't see the special vulnerability of being women or children, LGBT population. And also now that we are facing some cases of asylum seekers that have been kidnapped or disappeared in their transit, and it's hard that the authorities see this vulnerability in terms of the investigation of the policies for prevention and for disappearances. I will end this here my first presentation.
Thank you very much, Anna. And I think the issue one of the issues you raised, to look specifically on the time. Is there a specific time length considered necessary that you consider it an enforced disappearance? This is also one issue Grażyna Baranowska is addressing in her academic work, I would say. And as Grażyna has written the study for the German Institute for Human Rights on enforced disappearance, and in the context of migration. I would like also to add to your introduction that Grażyna has, in addition, wrote a whole book on rights of families of disappeared persons and how international bodies address the needs of families of disappeared persons in Europe, which is forthcoming with Intersentia, a transitional justice series, this summer in 2001. So, Gracina, if you would start your presentation, also you can reflect to your work and to intersectionality, but also it would be good to have your reflections actually on the different definitions of enforced disappearance and also the concept of missing people.
Thank you. So for my first presentation today, I prepared a short PowerPoint. So let me just see whether that will work. Do you see that? Okay. Is it okay? Do you see it? Can somebody tell me whether it's...
We can see it. It's great.
Okay. Okay, perfect. So thank you, Barbara, for the really kind introduction, and thank you for the organizers for putting together the great event last year and then again this year. So it has been an enormous effort to make it first in person and then online. So I really appreciate that the effort on the part of the organizers, and it's an honor to be with you two on the panel. So what I wanted to do today is I think a bit about the title of our chapter of this panel and how it relates to migrants. So we have two terms that are commonly used: disappeared migrants and missing migrants, and neither one of them is a legal term. So when we think about the legal term, then it's forcibly disappeared migrants. So those migrants that have been forcibly disappeared. And as Ana Lorena has already shown, and has been mentioned in previous panels and by Professor de Froville as well, this is still not. I mean, even that is not clear. So we have discussions: when exactly is it an enforced disappearance? But I want to speak a bit to those two first terms, the disappeared migrants and missing migrants. And so first I will speak about each one, and then I will think a bit about how I understand the terms. At the same time, I want to start saying that this is not to take sides. So I think both terms are useful and can bring in a certain reasoning to the discussion, and kind of to show that I think it's worth using both terms in certain aspects when we think about them, and because I was encouraged to show my work and explain how that relates to what I've done. So here are two things that I worked on last year. So first, a report which has been mentioned before, which is titled "Disappeared Migrants and Refugees," and then a project which is titled "Missing Migrants." So I used both during the same work, and that is because the report is clearly about those migrants, about the relevance of the Convention of Enforced Disappearances. So it's about the framework of human rights, while the project that I will be realizing at the Hannity School is broader on missing migrants, on how international organizations deal with the broader perspective, both with human rights violations, but also with the humanitarian approach and humanitarian action towards missing migrants. So starting with disappeared migrants, I believe that it's mostly used in the framework of enforced disappearances. So it's used to implicate the possibility of human rights violations. If we use the term disappeared migrants, even though it does not carry really a legal weight, then we are implicating that there is a human rights violation that has happened there. And this speaks a bit to the discussion that has been going on between missing and disappeared persons. And here I want to cite a fragment of a decision of the court, of a judgment. And I highlighted the one sentence that let me move that so you can see it. Okay, so I highlighted the one sentence that I think is particularly relevant. So it's a judgment from 2003, and here the state authorities are arguing, or the authorities are arguing, that the presumed victims decided to go into the woods and then went missing without a trace, kind of to show that they're not disappeared. And I personally can see states taking this argumentation exactly that the migrants decided to go into the forest, decided to go into the desert or into a river, and then went missing in order to claim that they have no responsibility for the disappearance of the migrants. And then the side that is claiming that responsibility will use the term disappeared migrant, even if there's not clear whether there was an enforced disappearance or not. And this is also a term that is predominantly used by both the Committee on Enforced Disappearances and the Working Group. And while I looked through the concluding observations on the Committee on Enforced Disappearances, both terms, disappeared migrants and missing migrants, have been used. It's predominantly disappeared migrants. And in the context of the guiding principles, it's disappeared migrants. Here you see it highlighted in the principle which concerns migration, and also in an important report of the working group that has been already mentioned today. Here I found the phrase is particularly interesting. So this is the only time where you can see missing migrants in the report when it speaks about missing or potentially disappeared migrants. So you see that there's clearly a conceptually difference between missing and disappeared migrants. At the same time, missing migrants is really commonly used. So the programs that international organizations set up with regards to migrants are called missing migrants and not disappeared migrants. And here you see the web pages of the IOM, the ICRC, the ICMP, and they predominantly frame this as missing migrants. And this has also clear benefits because it's potentially a wider range. So it's not only human rights violations, it's also migrants that went missing because of other factors that are not crime related, not state violation related. So it's different reasons that they go missing. And it triggers, coming back to the title of this panel, a humanitarian approach. So this is kind of easier. That's how I would connect when missing migrants are used and when it's useful also to use the term. So when we think missing migrants, I would guess that that's the most commonly associated picture that we think about. So those that went missing, in particular from a European perspective, at the Mediterranean, but there are many other seas and rivers where migrants go missing. At the same time, I would argue that we, as a missing migrants, we should see all those whose whereabouts remain unknown, as this is a much wider perspective than just those that have died at the sea. So those are those that were lost at sea, died unidentified, were secretly deprived of liberty. So those are the victims of enforced disappearance that appear to have been trafficked, and also those that disappear into the informal economy. So the whereabouts remain unknown should be kind of the starting point of who is considered missing migrants. And then we can use the humanitarian approach toward all of those whose whereabouts remain unknown, and the human rights law approach when human rights are violated. And those approaches should go hand in hand, and we cannot just use one of them. And with regard to human rights violation, there are, of course, enforced disappearances, and there are also other human rights violations which occur within the migration context, and that need to be addressed as well when we talk about missing migrants. So let me stop here. So thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Gratina. And I would like to come back to one question here from Mikhail Amit. I can't read the full name. Is asking what assistance the state of the Ukraine and the government of the Ukraine can get after they have ratified the convention. So from our UN Committee on Enforced Disappearance, the government has to present a report after 2 years after the ratification, and then we discuss this and give also recommendations what need to be improved, and to follow, for example, the exact definition, or to help actually also technically and giving training to state officials, for example, when designing national laws, or connecting them to institutions like let's say the International Commission on the Missing People, try to build forensic expertise and this kind of work, I would say, to cover your question. So far, the Ukraine has not been on the agenda, and we wait for their first report to our committee. Now, building on what you both have just said, would you or could you be even more specific? Where do you see state responsibility in the area of search and investigation when the victims are migrants? And as you come from very different regions, maybe also to build on this, and could you also reflect a little bit how the regional institutions you have, like in Latin Central Americas or in the European region, have you developed policies or decisions which can be used in order to strengthen the rights of migrant victims of a forced disappearance? And this would include also building on perhaps some very useful court decisions and case law to strengthen the fight against disappearance. And I think, looking on my regie, I wanted to have more questions, but looking at the time, I think we will have this and then maybe already come to an end. So perhaps Anna Lorena, you would like to start?
Yes, thank you very much. Okay, first about the responsibilities of the states. Of course, in the region, we see that still a big responsibility in terms of the documentation of the cases. This is something that have been recommended for different United Nations procedures of mechanism, but it's still an obligation that is not accomplished. So that's something that we still need to know how many migrants have been disappeared in the region, and this is an obligation that must be carried for the countries of origin, for the countries of transit, destination, of return, and also to remain the obligation about to have centralized information for searching the migrants, for the forensic information also. In Mexico, we still don't have a database that have all the DNAs, for example, of the bodies that we have in the country. So if I want to put an example, if Honduras or El Salvador has documented all the cases of families that have migrants that have been disappeared in Mexico, we cannot make the comparison with the DNAs because we don't have a central database that has all the information about the remains in Mexico. I also would like to talk in this point about the things that are happening in our country that are difficulting the searching and the investigation. In a country like Mexico, when you can say that you have a general situation of disappearances, we are talking about 84,000 disappearances that occurred since 2006 to the actual time. You can say that we have a general context of disappearance of the country. It is not working that we still searching or investigating the case by case. So we are ignoring, when we have a new case or when we have a case, we are ignoring this general context where the disappearances occur. We are not working, taking care of the patterns, for example, where the disappearances occur. We are not using the context information to know where are some territories that are taken by the organized crime groups. So if we still investigating case by case, I think we are not going to have any success, any success in terms of finding the migrants. And also some other problems that we are facing now is, I will call this like administrative disappearances of the remains. We have some cases, for example, in Tamaulipas, where they have been disappeared 2 migrants that the authority the authority from Tamaulipas, that is a state that is in the northern of Mexico, a state where occur a lot of disappearances and where the massacres occur. The authorities accepted that they have the bodies of the migrants. They accept that the migrants were killed, but they can find the bodies. So this is happening in Tamaulipas, but it is happening in many of the places of Mexico that it is occurring an administrative disappearance of remains. And I think that we need to think deeply, what does it mean in a context of general disappearances? The responsibility of the state is not something that happened casual. I think we need to see deeply if there is an intention of disappearances of the bodies. We have some cases, for example, in the cases that we are working of mass graves, that when we have been documented that many cases of the migrants were sent by the state to mass graves, even though that they have DNA of families and of the bodies that can be make a comparison. They didn't do the correct comparison, so they sent the migrants to mass grave without taking care of a proper identification process. We have some other cases, for example, where they sent these migrants, the authorities sent the migrants to mass graves, the migrants that they found in the massacres, and they sent that, for example, with identifications on the clothing. I mean, they didn't even do a proper forensic job to see who the migrant is. So I think we need to think deeply, what is this responsibility of the states? And also we have cases where we have irregular delivery of remains. The authorities give a body to a family that doesn't belong to the family. There is a forensic work later on that says that the body doesn't belong to the family. The authorities know that there is an incorrect identification, and they do nothing. So how do you call these cases? What is the category for putting these cases and the responsibility of the state in terms of disappearances? And also we have many cases where the authority, when they receive all the reports of missing migrants, they just accumulated in big files all the reports and did anything about it. They didn't do anything to search the migrants. So when you have a systematic actuation of when you have a systematic responsibility of the state not doing something in a country where a lot of disappearances occur, I think we need to think deeply the responsibility of the states. And talking about what should be the authorities doing about the disappearances of migrants, we have been talking a lot with organizations that work with migrants in transit, and of course we think that the best way to avoid or to prevent disappearances of migrants is that the migrants have a safe transit guarantees to go to one country to another. If the migrants are traveling not in a safe mode, if they are traveling clandestinely, they are put more in danger. So I think it's not an easy question, it's not an easy issue, but as long as we don't have guarantees, safe guarantees for the transit of migrants, these disappearances will still occurring. In terms of the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly and Regular Migration, we have some obligations in terms of the information that the migrants need for the travel. Any of the countries are accomplishing this guarantee of giving the migrants safe information about, for example, in Mexico, where they can face a territory that is in danger because they have a lot of groups of organized crimes. The migrants don't have this information. Of if they have the information, they don't have anything. They don't know where to go when the case occur. Also, I think we need also in terms of what is happening of the Global Compact, I think we have an opportunity from all the mechanisms and procedures of the United Nations to work together with all the institutions that are making these plans about how to regulate the migration in the region. For example, we have some meetings that are occurring now around the Global Pact of Migration, but we don't see any of the procedures or the mechanisms of United Nations going to this place to say the recommendations or to address what are the dangers of the migrants in transit. So we don't see how all the recommendations in terms of human rights are going to be integrated in the Global Compact. There is an opportunity for the different mechanisms and procedures of United Nations to go to these discussions of the Global Compact to address all the recommendations in terms of disappearances, in terms of extrajudicial execution, so they can be addressed in all the measures that they are going to take in terms of the things that they are working now with the countries. And also, I would like to address something that is happening in the region, but this is also happening in Europe. We have been having different agreements of migration. These agreements that have been placed in Europe and in Mexico for the third country, the safe third country. These agreements are causing a deep risk for the migrants. For example, in Mexico signed this agreement for the control of the flow of migrants with the United States. And this have the consequence that Mexico is using the army for migration task. This is a big risk for the migrants. And I think in this issue, we need the different procedures and the different mechanisms of the United Nations to go deeply and to investigate and to give us some standards about how dangerous is to use the army for migration tasks. We have nothing about. I mean, we have only a few things about it, but we don't have anything that can give us an idea about how to give a specific recommendation to the states about the risks that are that they are using the army for a migration task. And well, I think I'm going to stop here, and then if we have more time, we can continue with the conversation.
Thank you, Ana Lorena. We just had a meeting 2 weeks ago in Geneva with the Committee on the Convention on the Migrants and their Families. It was outside our committee, so we could discuss very freely. And clearly, this point, the militarization and of border protection, is also something which they discuss. Gracina, now to you. And there is actually one question. You may refer briefly on the missing children, not on enforced, but missing children in Europe. Thank you.
Yes, so to make it short, what I will try to do is I will first add, I absolutely agree with what Ana Lorena talked about strengthening, and I would just add a couple of things which I think are interesting in that discussion. And in that context, I would try to answer some of the questions in the chat. Then I will speak shortly about the European Court of Human Rights, and I will try to sum up with some thoughts on the prevention. So not only addressing enforced disappearances of migrants, but which should be done to prevent the thing. So additionally to what has been like the crucial things about remains, administrative issues, and databases that have been already mentioned, what I would ask is cross-border cooperation, in particular cross-border reporting of cases, but also cross-border working with victims of enforced disappearances. And what I think is crucial is mentioning that victims of enforced disappearance should be recognized as such. And one of the reasons that I see which is problematic using missing migrants when they are in fact forcibly disappeared, that then we do not recognize them as victims of enforced disappearances. And in the context of enforced disappearances, it's important to remember that also the families are victims of enforced disappearances, and that is very specificity of this human rights violation. So there should be support and cooperation between states to support also the families of enforced disappearances. And I think it is really a strong obligation under the convention that should be highlighted and thought through. So that brings me to one of the questions, that is the families of missing migrants. And well, their protection is not as strong as of families of victims of enforced disappearances because they are victims of enforced disappearances themselves. But there are clearly obligations of the state to undertake investigations also when it's not a case of enforced disappearance. And this has been found also by courts. And then there's Article 3. So at least the obligation to investigate is clear, and to keep the families informed. And here we can look at the case law of the European Court of Human Rights also, which is kind of strong in this regard as well. The obligation for reparation is much less developed. And here I would say, because the question was truth, justice, reparation, I would say truth and justice would be something that we could be enforced with reparation. That's still a way to go. And that brings me also to another question in the chat with regard to missing children. And as far as I understood the report, this is clearly not an example of enforced disappearances. It's children, refugee and migrant children that were in state facilities and went missing from those state facilities. And most of them left for various reasons by themselves. So there's clearly a responsibility by the state. I would say, choosing from the two committees that were mentioned in the comment, probably more a case for the Committee of the Rights of Children. Although also with regard to enforced disappearances, there is the obligation to keep records of people in facilities and so on, which would make it possible for the committee to react to that. But I would probably rather take the case under the rights of the children that the states that facilitated those institutions were obliged to look out for the best interest of those children in those facilities, and they most probably did not. So that would be probably the best way that I would choose. So now looking at the European Court of Human Rights, so one of the good developments over the last 2 decades is that it has made huge developments with regard to substantiating claims in disappearance cases. So it shifted the burden of proof, which was first on in certain areas, it comes to the state, and I think that is something that clearly can be used in cases of missing and disappeared migrants. Also, it clearly says that there are obligations of state, regardless whether or not the state itself has been found responsible for the disappearance. So that reflects also to the question asked by Marta before. There are also, I think what is interesting and can be looked into, there are cases with regard to Russia that have been filed by Russian nationals that during the time they filed the cases to the European Court of Human Rights resided in other countries than Russia, which will be the case for most of missing and disappeared migrants. So here there's also an example. Then I would expect most cases to be filed, or many cases to be filed, to more than one country. And here again, the European Court of Human Rights has experience with dealing with those cases and has very clearly and carefully looked at the responsibility of 2 states when the case was directed toward 2 states. And what I actually learned about last week during a conference on the implementation of judgments of the European Court of Human Rights, the Committee of Ministers has recently started to cooperate with the working group on enforced disappearances with regard to implementing cases against Russia. So this cooperation is also something that can be used, since the working group has also experience and expertise in this context of disappearances of migrants. And last not least, because I think we're coming to an end, and I think I really wanted to say something about prevention, is that, well, from a European perspective.
Okay, sorry, I was overly correct. We have enough time. So you should just go ahead, and then in the second or in the last round you can address prevention then.
Okay, perfect. And to the Ukrainian case, the working group on enforced disappearances has addressed disappearances not only by Ukraine but also by the non-state actors there. So I think that is also something that can be related to the question that has been answered before.
Mm-hmm. Then Grażyna, maybe if you allow, you could come back to this case of an enforced disappearance which occurred in Greece, and the victim was a teacher from Turkey. And because at this case, I learned from you actually how to look at this, how long needs an enforced disappearance to take place to be considered an enforced disappearance. This can there be from this case given some lessons learned also to Anna Lorena, whose problem she said at the beginning that it's a problem that in Mexico authorities say, oh, well, that is too short. That's not a real enforced disappearance. Grażyna?
So the example, I guess it's the easiest to remember things from example. So it's a teacher from Turkey that travels to Greece, and so she was apprehended by Greece authorities allegedly, and then she was kept in a place for a while and then pushed back, which in my opinion can never be called a pushback since she was already in Greece, but she was pushed back to Turkish territory and found herself in a Turkish prison. And due to the fact that she was in contact with her brother and the lawyer that were in Greece, there is evidence that she was actually in Greece and in the hands of Greek authorities. And due to this evidence, there are no doubts that this was an enforced disappearance. And she was there for, I don't think it was a whole day, but because it was not only a car, it was the place, and I think it was an arrest as far as I remember. And of course, Greek authorities are denying that she was there, as is the case in enforced disappearance cases. And I think what is crucial here is the evidence that we usually don't have, because migrants, when they're traveling, they usually don't have this family member or friend, which is in the place that they can take contact with. And due to that, they do not have this evidence that they were apprehended. So in my opinion, this is the two crucial issues when the cases will be brought to court, and I'm sure about that, are first the short-term effect, and secondly, substantiating claims. So they will have less evidence than usually in an enforced disappearance case because there's no one asking about their fate. And here, this is an example where the lawyers have built the case due to evidence that they have, which will not always be available. And I would be fascinated to know the answer to the example that was asked during the Q&A. So for somebody that was just a couple of minutes in the car with the intent to be disappeared and then left the car, or to what Anna Lorena said, just for 1 hour in the car of state authorities and then left to non-state actors. And with this 1 hour, I don't think I can give an answer to that. So clearly, as we've heard during the keynote, this would not fit into the Rome Statute definition because it's not a prolonged time. At some point, it would fit into the definition by the Committee on Enforced Disappearances, but so far, the discussion at international courts was more about, is a couple of days enough? And clearly a couple of days is enough, and not is a couple of hours enough. And I'm pretty sure that with the migration cases, we will come to courts having to address the question whether a couple of hours is enough, but we're not yet there. And my professional opinion is that a couple of hours is enough. So that's...
Thank you. Thank you. So we have, I think, 15 minutes left for our last round. And so please feel free also to add what you want to say to this subject. But also, could you make suggestions to strengthen actually the prevention that migrants do not fall victims of enforced disappearance? And maybe Anna Lorena, you again.
Thank you. Yes, well, I would like to talk again about the global compact on migration, because for us that we have, as an NGO, we have been involved in the different stages of this agreement. And what we see is that we are having an implementation of this agreement without the participation of the different procedures and mechanisms from United Nations. I think it will be very helpful. I am thinking in our region, it will be very helpful, for example, in the discussions, as I said in my last intervention, for example, to see what recommendations are from the different bodies of the United Nations for disappearances, for extrajudicial executions. So I think we need more participation of the different mechanisms of United Nations in this global compact. And I see that as a way of prevention, but also as a way to push all the recommendations that the different mechanisms of United Nations has for every country. If we can see, for example, now, there are several recommendations, and I think we have a very vast jurisprudence in the region about standards, principles to investigate and to prevent enforced disappearances. But how do we accomplish all of these recommendations? That is the problem, and that is the key. So I see an opportunity the implementation of the global compact, but we need the different procedures to get involved in this discussion of the global compact, because we don't see all of the procedures involved on that. So maybe I know that the different offices of United Nations in every country are involved in the implementation of the global compact, but it will be good for that the different procedures of United Nations have more communication with the offices of United Nations in the country, so they can give all the recommendations that you have in terms of disappearances of migrants. So this can be worked in the global compact, because we don't see how to join the work of the global compact and all the recommendations of different procedures of United Nations. So that's a task that needs to be doing, and I think now there is a good moment to do it. And also I would like to talk about some I think that are good practices that we are having now in Mexico and in the region. What we see is that we need to see more multidisciplinary work in one specific phenomena of disappearances. So, for example, we are seeing the mass graves, the cases of mass graves that we have in Mexico, but we think that we need to see all the responsibilities of the states, talking with different procedures of United Nations. So for us, for example, it's important that in one specific phenomenon can get involved the different mechanisms of United Nations, the Rapporteur for Migrants, the Group of Enforced Disappearances, the Committee for Enforced Disappearances, but also, for example, the Rapporteur on Independences of Judges, the Committee Against Torture, because when you have a situation like the Mexican situation, when you have institutions that are very weak, or a general situation of violence, you cannot see the problem separately. I mean, if you are going to see the disappearances, you need to see how the system of justice is working in terms of the independence, in terms of the autonomy of the justice of the system. You need to see what are the special vulnerabilities for children, for women, for indigenous people, because what we have been seeing in the cases of migrants is that you have all the vulnerabilities together, and in one case you can find all the human rights violations, torture, disappearances, executions, and the different vulnerabilities of the people. So probably it's good, and we are doing this. We are having conversations with different members of different mechanisms of United Nations to see one specific problem. And that is helping us very much to understand integrally the problem and not seeing that separately from some other problems that we have in a specific region. So, for example, we were talking this week with Luciano, with Bernard, and with Morris from the rapporteur on extrajudicial executions. And we have different recommendations and different different recommendations from each body, but we need these recommendations from the different bodies of United Nations to talk between them, to analyze the problem that is occurring in one context. And of course, we need also the rapporteur of independence of judges, because many of the problems that we have in terms of the searching and in terms of the investigations has to do with the independence of these bodies. So that could be a good idea. We have one exercise, a very good exercise at the beginning of the year for a specific issue of the independence of the prosecutor office. Different bodies of United Nations related to executions, related to disappearances, made a communication to the Mexican state, even though that it was an issue about the prosecutor office. So how can you, from the different bodies, see integrally the facts that are occurring in a place? It will be good. And also, I think in terms of migration, we need to have the different offices of United Nations of the different countries working together. This is a big challenge. In our region, for example, we don't see the offices of Mexico office of the United Nations working with the office of Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. And if we don't see this issue of migration as a transnational problem, it's going to be hard to find any solution for prevention or for investigation. So we need to see this really in an international and transnational level.
Yes. Thank you very much, Ana Lorena. And now, Grażyna.
Thank you. Yes, I really like the highlighting of the cooperation and the co-working between different agencies. And I think kind of the starting point for any strengthening of prevention is the strengthening of the general framework of justice in each country. And if the general system of justice, talking about police, prisons, migration officers, works in the line of the rule of law, then that's kind of the best prevention that of general measures that can be given. I would say that a preventive measure is also calling enforced disappearances when they are enforced disappearances. So not calling it by its name, not calling it missing or kidnapping, as has been mentioned before, but calling it enforced disappearances when there is involvement of state authorities. And data, collecting data and making it available is also something that I think is really strong on pushing countries toward doing something. And strictly with regards to migration, let me highlight three things. So firstly, border violence. And in the context of border violence, and in particular at the borders of the European Union, this is where migrants disappear and go missing. So I said pushbacks, but there are many forms of border violence which trigger then disappearances and missing. So that would be a good stop to prevent enforced disappearances. Also, and here I'm speaking again from the European perspective, but the same is true for other regions of the world, limit or if possible eliminate at all externalization of migration processes, because we see enforced disappearances taking place in different countries that receive funding from the European Union to keep the migrants from entering the European Union. And the third part is probably the elephant in the room, so make legal entry possible. So that is, I know it sounds overly optimistic, but I feel it should be stated, because the reason why enforced disappearances and why migrants go missing is that they have no possibility or very limited possibility to enter different regions of the world in a legal way. So that would be the number one way to prevent enforced disappearances of migrants.
Yes, thank you very much. And this white elephant has a lot of colors actually, and is addressed by a lot of people from science and NGOs when discussing prevention. But unfortunately, those suggestions are not taken on board by the political decision makers. Maybe it's changing a little bit now in the US, as I've heard, that they open the channels better for legal migration, but certainly not in the European Union. In summing up, I just would like also to refer to another region, the African region. And I think in the context of the African Union and the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, they are working on a declaration on enforced disappearance. And in doing this and working on this, of course, also migration is very important, because some of the African states host the biggest migrants and refugees communities. And here I can also hear a little bit that states are much more open to addressing state responsibilities, also not only for their citizens, but also from when enforced disappearance occurs for a migrant in their country. Yeah, and maybe just briefly, Anna Lorena, we had in our committee work this past 3 weeks, also actually encouraging move from the Mexican government in saying, if the COVID pandemic allows, we might prepare for a visit to send a delegation to Mexico. Yes, but we do this several years, and it's always another reason why it cannot happen. But this is again. And then, of course, it is also relevant that the NGOs address also the issue of migrants, so that also we are lobbied that this is a subject that is very important, I would say. And making a last advertisement, if I may say so, we in the committee do need a lot of more cases from different regions to go ahead, because we really take it serious. From September on, we would like to develop a more authoritative, either a statement or even a comment on the issue. And to do this, we need to have broad support. We cannot do this alone. So thank you again, both of you. Continue with your good work. Stay in touch. And also thank you to the University of Erlangen and the Nuremberg Academy for giving the space for this panel. Now back to Markus Krajewski. Thank you.